She was 18 years old, and she had nothing left. What she carried into that country fit inside a single canvas grip and the crook of one arm, a change of clothes gone grey from washing, a tin cup, a folded square of oilcloth, and her father's riveting hammer, its head pitted and blued from 40 years of honest heat, its hickory handle worn smooth and pale by the grip of a dead man's hand. In a pouch sewn into her skirt she carried $37, the whole of what the world had left her. With 5 of those dollars, she bought a thing that every sensible person in 3 counties had already spent years pretending not to see, a derelict iron water tower standing over a dead town in the Alkali Flats, rusted shut, bone dry, and worth, by every ledger and every laughing bidder, precisely nothing. But what nobody knew, what she herself could not have imagined as she counted 5 silver dollars into a stranger's palm, was that sealed inside that ruined tank lay a 30-year-old secret that would unmake the man who cast her out, and build her a new life from the wreckage. So settle in, and pour something warm, and let the lamp burn low, because this one runs long and deserves your patience. Before we go on, tell us where you are watching from tonight, what town, what county, what quiet kitchen or late road, because we like to know who rides along with us. And if you find yourself carried by it, stay to the end and follow along. Let us tell you the story of Etta Vane. She had grown up in the ring and clatter of her father's shop on the green banks of a river town called Marrow's Bend, where the water ran brown with mill silt, and the air tasted of coal smoke and cut iron. Silas Vane was a boilermaker and a tanksmith, one of that vanishing tribe of men who could take flat plate and rivet and hammer and coax it into vessels that would hold water and steam and pressure without weeping a single drop. He had no son, and he did not seem to grieve the lack, for he set his daughter on a nail keg beside the forge before she could read and taught her the trade the way other fathers taught prayers. She learned the weight of the hammer before she learned her letters. She learned the difference between wrought and cast, the color of iron at cherry heat and at straw, the patient art of the rivet, heat it white, set it, buck it, and pin the head down tight while your partner holds firm on the other side, 2 hands and 2 hammers and 1 mind between them. He taught her, above all, one thing, and he said it so often that it wore a groove in her the way his hand wore the handle of his hammer. Everything has a grain, he would tell her, holding a bar to the lamplight so she could see the long fibers in the metal. Iron has it, and oak has it, and stone has it, and so does every living soul who ever drew breath. A poor smith fights the grain and splits his work and blames the material. A good smith reads the grain first, and then he works with it, not against it, and the thing he makes lasts 100 years. She was perhaps 9 when she first understood he was not only talking about iron. She was much older before she understood how completely he had meant it. On her 16th birthday he put his own hammer into her hands, the one his own master had given him, and he closed her fingers around the hickory and said that a tool that had been worked was worth 10 that had only been bought, because a work tool remembered. 2 winters later the coal dust that had lived in his lungs since boyhood finally took the rest of him. He died on a grey morning with his hand in hers, and his last coherent instruction was not tender and not frightened but practical, the way a craftsman's love had always been practical. Keep the hammer oiled, he told her, and keep the handle out of the wet, and it will outlast you as it outlasted me. Then the grain of him gave way, and he was gone. Into the silence he left came a man of paper and ink. His name was Corvin Ashby, and he was the sort of man who had never in his life lifted anything heavier than a pen, and who had learned early that a pen, in the right hand, could lift a great deal more than any hammer. He held the mortgage on the shop, or said he did, and he held notes against the coal account, and he held, it developed, a great many documents that Silas Vane, who could read a bar of iron better than a line of type, had signed across the years with a trusting and unlettered hand. Ashby measured the world in columns. He did not hate Etta Vane. Hatred would have required him to see her as a person, and he saw her only as an entry, a figure in the wrong side of a book, a small negative sum to be zeroed out and forgotten. Within a month of the funeral he had tallied against the shop a debt so precise, so studded with interest and fees and back charges, that no honest year of labor could ever have paid it. She looked at the invoice a long time. She knew iron did not lie, and she suspected that ink often did, But she had no way to prove the second thing, and there was no room for argument. The casting out, when it came, arrived not as a shout but as a sheet of paper. A boy on a bicycle brought it, tipped his cap, and pedaled off whistling, unaware he had carried a small execution in his satchel. It was a printed form with her name and her father's name filled into the blank spaces in a clerk's tidy copperplate, and it informed her, in the flat courteous language such papers always use, that the premises were forfeit and that she was to quit them by the end of the week. There was no signature she could reach, no face she could appeal to, only the seal of the bank and the machinery behind it grinding on as it had ground on 1,000 others. That was the cruelty of it, and she understood the cruelty exactly. A man who screams at you at least admits you are there. Ashby had reduced her removal to arithmetic, and delegated it to a form, so that no human being need ever feel the weight of it. She did not plead. She did not weep, not where anyone could see. She spent her last 3 days in the shop cleaning it as her father would have wanted it cleaned, sweeping the swarf, banking the fire, hanging the tongs in their order on the wall. Then she wrapped the riveting hammer in the square of oilcloth, tied it with a leather thong, and set it in her grip beside the tin cup and the folded clothes. She walked out through the wide door she had walked through her whole life, and she pulled it to behind her, and she did not look back. She went west because west was where the maps went thin. She had heard, as everyone had heard, that a person could buy a whole town out in the territories for the price of a good coat, and that water and iron were wanted everywhere the railroads pushed, and she reasoned, with the cold clear reason of someone who has already lost everything, that a boilermaker's daughter would always find work wherever men needed to hold water in a dry place. She rode the cars as far as her thin fold of dollars allowed, and then she rode a jolting mail wagon, and then she walked. The country changed under her like a slow tide going out. First the green river valleys, fat and managed, every field fenced and every creek bridged, prosperity you could smell in the manure and the cut hay. Then the land began to forget itself. The fences grew ragged and then vanished. The green thinned to gray green and then to gray. The rivers pulled back into their beds and then into memory, leaving only pale scars of sand where water had once run and might run again for an hour in some violent August. By the 4th day the world was a great tawny table of alkali and creosote and far blue mountains that never seemed to come nearer, a country so wide and so indifferent that it made her fall from the shop in Narrow's Bend feel small, and strangely, that smallness was the first thing in months that let her breathe. The place she was bound for had been called, in its brief good years, Halloran Wells, a watering stop where the stage line and later a spur of the railroad had paused to slake their engines and their teams. Now it was called nothing much, a scatter of adobe melting back into the ground it was born from, a plank hotel with its roof caved like a broken chest, and standing over all of it, taller than anything for 40 miles, an iron water tower on 4 riveted legs, gone the deep bruised red-brown of old rust, its great cylindrical tank sealed and silent against the enormous sky. A land company out of the county seat was selling off the dead town's bones that week, lot by lot, for whatever the desert wind would pay. Etta Vane arrived on foot at the tail of the afternoon, dust to the knee, and stood at the back of a small crowd of speculators and scavengers while a fat auctioneer in a sweated collar sold off doors and window glass and a rusted stove. When he came to the water tower, the crowd laughed before he finished the sentence. It was dry, someone called out, dry 30 years, the spring under it played out or poisoned or gone to the devil, and the tank itself welded shut with rust and not worth the powder to blow it. Who would haul that iron out of here, and to where, and for what? The auctioneer, half joking, asked for any bit at all, $1, a dime, a kind word. And Etta Vane, standing at the back in her father's shadow, looked up at the long clean lines of that tank the way another woman might look at a cathedral, and she saw, past the rust, the honest work in it, the true courses of the plates, the neat marching rivets, the pride of some long-dead smith who had built it to last. She raised her hand and said $5, clear and level, and the whole crowd turned to look at the girl who wanted the one thing nobody wanted. It was not much of a contest. The hammer fell. She counted 5 silver dollars into the auctioneer's damp palm, and the desert, which had been waiting a very long time, said nothing at all. There was no house left to her, so she made her shelter in the least ruined corner of the caved hotel, propping fallen planks into a lean-to against the standing wall, and spreading her oilcloth for a floor. Water was the first problem and the oldest one, and here fortune, or something like it, took her hand. Behind the dead town, a quarter-mile up a dry wash, an old man kept a seep alive by main force and stubbornness, a retired well-driller and pumpman named Ambrose Teague, who had come to Halloran Wells 40 years before to sink shafts and had simply never left, outliving the town the way a stump outlives the tree. He was bent and burnt to leather and slow of speech, and he watched her carry her bucket up the wash 3 days running before he spoke to her at all. When he did speak, it was to say that the girl who bought the tower was either a fool or the first sensible person to come through in 20 years, and he had not yet decided which. She told him she was a tanksmith's daughter and a tanksmith herself, and that she meant to open the tower and see what 40 years of rust had sealed. He laughed, a dry sound like sand in a pipe, and then he looked at her a while longer, and he said that a body needed water to live and he had water, and a body needed a reason to keep on, and he had run clean out of reasons, and that perhaps they might strike a bargain. She would share his seep. He would lend her his hands and his knowledge of the ground. It was not charity in either direction. It was two people with nothing, agreeing to be, together, slightly less than nothing. The labor began at first light, and it did not spare her. To open a tank that iron and rust have sealed is not a thing of one blow but of 10,000, and she went at it the way her father had taught her, reading the work before she touched it. She climbed the riveted legs with a rope around her waist and Teague paying it out below, and she went over every seam and every plate with her hands and her eyes, learning the grain of the thing, where it was sound and where the rust had eaten it to lace. The old manhole cover at the crown of the tank was frozen solid, its bolts swollen into their holes and grown over with a scab of corrosion the color of dried blood. She soaked them in the last of Teague's coal oil and let it work overnight. She warmed them with a fire of creosote branches banked in an old skillet lifted flush against the iron. And then she took up her father's hammer, the hickory smooth and sure in her hand, and she began. Clang! A chip of rust flew, orange and glittering, and spun away down the long fall to the ground. Clang! The old cold chisel bit into the sea's bolt head, and she felt the shock of it climb her wrist and settle in her shoulder, and she welcomed it, because it was clean, because it was work, because for the length of each stroke there was no ledger and no form and no boy on a bicycle, only iron and will and the good honest argument between them. Clang! She worked with the grain of the rust and not against it, finding the line where the corrosion had made the metal brittle and letting the chisel walk that line. Days of it. Her palms split and healed and split again, and grew a horn of callus her father would have known by touch in the dark. Teague hauled and steadied and cursed the sun and told her, in the evenings, stories of the country as it had been, and she listened and hammered and did not hurry, because her father had taught her that hurry is the enemy of the true seam. One bolt gave, and then another, and then, on the 9th morning, with a groan that seemed to come up out of the earth itself, the whole crusted manhole cover broke free of its seat and swung back on its ruined hinge, and out of the black mouth of the tank came a breath of air that had been sealed away since before she was born. She went down into it on the rope with a lantern, and Teague held the line, and the light swung and steadied and showed her the inside of the great dry tank, its plates furred with rust, its floor drifted with a fine red dust like the sand of some inner desert. And at the bottom, in the far curve where the shadow lay deepest, the lantern found two things that stopped her breath. The first was a man, or what 40 dry years had left of a man, seated with his back against the iron as though he had only sat down to rest, his hat still on the ruin of his head, his boots crossed at the ankle, patient as the desert itself. The second, cradled in the crook of his arm and against the wall beside him, was a row of stout canvas sacks gone stiff and brown with age, and an oilcloth bundle tied with cord, and when she knelt and with trembling and reverent hands loosened the neck of the nearest sack, the lantern light ran gold. Coins. Double eagles, $20 pieces, hundreds of them, thousands stamped with dates that reached back before the town was born, heavy and cold and utterly indifferent to how long they had waited. She knelt there in the belly of the iron with the dead man for company, and the gold spilling cool across her split palms, and she did not laugh and she did not shout. She wept, once, quietly, for reasons she could not have named, and then she wiped her face on her sleeve and reached for the oilcloth bundle, because a tanksmith's daughter knows that the vessel matters less than what it was built to hold, and she understood, even then, that the true cargo of that iron was not the gold. Inside the oilcloth, kept dry all those years by the sealed tank and the desert air, lay a ledger bound in cracked leather and folded within its pages, a letter, sealed with a blot of wax and addressed in a careful, fading hand to whoever should find it. The ledger she opened first, and its columns told a story in the only language that men like Corvin Ashby ever trusted, the language of figures, and the figures told of a water company founded 30 and more years before, in the town's first hope, when a man named Emery Dane had come into that dry country believing that whoever mastered the water would bless the land, and had gathered the small savings of every settler, and teamster, and hopeful soul for 40 miles into a common fund to sink the wells and raise the tower and hold the water for all. And the letter, when at last she broke the wax and unfolded it there by lantern light with the dead man's empty boots before her, told the rest, and she read it slowly, and then she read it aloud to Ambrose Teague at the tower's foot that same evening, all of it, from first word to last. To whoever opens this iron, it began, I ask first your pardon for the company you find me in, for I am the man who built this tank, and I have chosen it for my grave because it is the truest thing I ever made and the last honest place in this valley. My name is Emery Dane. I raised the water company of Halloran Wells with the pooled coin of poor and trusting people, and I raised this tower to hold the water that would keep them, and for 3 good years it did. Then came a man named Absalom Ashby, with a fine coat and a finer manner and a satchel full of paper, and he showed us how much better our little company might do if we let him carry the books. We were builders and diggers and drovers, and we could read the ground but not the ledger, and that was our ruin, for while we dug he wrote, and while we trusted he tallied, and by the time the water began to fail he had, on paper, made himself the owner of everything we had made with our hands. He had salted the assay reports to frighten off the railroad's engineers. He had quietly bought the paper on every well and every claim. And when at last he had it all, he let the town die, because a dead town's water rights, held clean and clear, were worth more to the men he sold them to downstream than a living town would ever be. He murdered this place with a pen, and he never once raised his voice. The letter went on, and her own voice did not shake though the lantern flame did. I gathered what remained of the company's true reserve. It said the coin these people had trusted to me and that Ashby had not yet found a lawful way to steal, and I hid it in the one vessel he would never think to open, for he despised the tank as a thing of mere iron and labor, beneath a man of his standing. I meant to carry it out and restore it to the families before they scattered. But the fever that walks this country in the dry months walked into me, and I have not the strength to climb down again, and so I have made my peace and my accounting here, in the cool and the quiet, with the honest iron at my back. Whoever you are, the wealth beneath my arm is not mine, and it was never Ashby's. It belongs to the people he cheated, and to their children, and to their children's children. I charge you, by whatever you hold sacred, do not spend it on yourself. Find them. Pay them what is theirs. Let the ledger be your map. This is the only justice left to me, and I hand it now to you. Signed, Emery Dane, in the 30th year of my age and the last of my life. She sat with that a long while, and the desert night came down enormous and cold and thick with stars, and Ambrose Teague, who had known the town in its dying and had never understood why it died, put his leathery hand over his mouth and wept for the neighbors he had outlived. And Etta Vane understood that a door had opened wider than the manhole in the tank, and that on the far side of it lay a choice. She could take the letter and the ledger to the county seat and lay them before a judge, and there would be years of lawyers and appeals, and Ashby, who owned paper the way other men owned air, would very likely bury the truth under more paper still. She could carry it to the newspapers and make of her father's death and Dane's a public spectacle, and have the satisfaction, for a week, of seeing the name Ashby dragged through print. Or she could hear, under all of it, the voice of her own father holding a bar to the lamp. Everything has a grain. You do not master a wrong by fighting it head-on, splitting yourself against it, and blaming the wood. You read it first, and then you work with the grain of it, and you make the thing that lasts. Dane had not asked for vengeance. He had asked for restoration. And restoration, she saw, was simply repair, and repair was the one thing in all the world she had been born and raised and taught to do. So she chose the harder and the quieter road, and she took Emery Dane's ledger for her map. She did not go to the law, and she did not go to the papers, and she never once, in all that followed, spoke the name of Corvin Ashby to a soul who did not already know it. Instead, she and Ambrose Teague, working from the crabbed columns of names 3 decades cold, began the long, patient labor of finding the cheated and their kin. They were scattered to the 4 winds, as the ruined always are, and some were dead, and some were only a headstone and a widow, and some had drifted no farther than the next dry valley and were scratching the same living from the same reluctant ground. To each of them, when she found them, she came without ceremony. She did not explain the whole of it at first. She would ask their name, and their father's name, and then she would check it against Dane's ledger, and then she would count out into their startled hands the full sum that Absalom Ashby had taken from their family 30 years before, in good gold double eagles, and she would ask, in return, only that they set their mark upon a receipt, so that the accounting would be true and complete and could never be undone. She insisted on the receipts with a Boilermaker's stubbornness, and in time Teague understood why. A rivet you cannot see is a rivet you cannot trust, her father used to say, and she meant for every dollar of Dane's restitution to hold a scene that no man of paper could ever pick apart. Signed receipt by signed receipt, mark by mark, thumbprint by thumbprint, she built a structure of small documented truths as sound and as riveted as the tank itself, and the beauty of it was that it needed no judge to bless it, and no headline to defend it. It simply was. The people who had been robbed had been made whole, by their own signed testimony, and against that quiet mass of ordinary honest paper, all of Ashby's cleverness had nothing to push. She was not fighting his ledgers. She was making a better ledger, and letting the truth of it stand. And as the gold went out, something came back that she had not planned for, and could not have bought. The families she repaid did not simply pocket the coin and turn away. A restored debt, it turned out, has a grain of its own, and it runs toward gratitude, and gratitude runs toward return. A man whose father's savings she had handed back rode 2 days to Halloran Wells to help her and Teague reset the tower's rotten footings, because he had been a bridge carpenter, and could not bear to see good ironwork stand on bad wood. A widow whose settlement Etta had delivered sent her 2 sons to clear the choke spring behind Teague's seep, and when they were done the water came up cold and sweet and steady for the first time in a generation, and the sound of it running was the sound of the town's own heart starting again. Someone brought seed. Someone brought a milk goat. Someone repaired the caved roof of the hotel in trade for nothing at all except the memory of being repaid when they had long since stopped hoping. It happened slowly, the way rust happens and the way healing happens, a little each day and invisible hour to hour, but season by season the dead town of Halloran Wells filled quietly back up with the small reciprocal kindnesses of people who had learned, from a girl and a ledger, that debts could run the other way. As for Corvin Ashby, far off in his bank in Narrow's Bend, there was no reckoning, no ruin in a single dramatic stroke, no scene upon a courthouse step. That was not how men of his kind fell, and Etta never wished it to be. His undoing was made of the same stuff as his power, only turned against him, paper, and time, and the slow indifference of a world that had stopped needing him. The water rights his father had murdered a town to hold, and that he had inherited and hoarded, proved worth less and less as the railroads found other routes and the downstream syndicates failed and the desert, which keeps its own ledger, quietly reclaimed the flats his family had schemed to own. His notes came due and could not be met. His debtors, some of them the very families Etta had made whole and unafraid, no longer bent to him. His bank was absorbed by a larger one, and then that one by another, and his name came off the door and off the letterhead and finally off the memory of the town, until he was simply an old man in a rented room with a satchel of paper that no longer commanded anything. He did not go to prison. He did not stand in the dock. He simply became irrelevant, which for a man who had measured his whole life in figures was perhaps the one true poverty. Etta Vane never saw him again, and never once went looking, because the grain of her life by then ran clean in another direction entirely, and to have turned back toward him would have been to fight the wood. She stayed in Halloran Wells, which in time the people took to calling, half in earnest, Vane's Wells, though she never asked them to and always waved the name away. She built a proper shop under the shadow of the tower she had bought for $5, and she filled the country's need for a smith who could hold water in a dry place, sinking tanks and mending pumps and teaching the trade, patiently and without hurry, to any child who would sit still on a nail keg and learn the color of iron at cherry heat. The tower itself she repaired last of all and best of all, riveting new plate where the old had gone to lace, and when the mended spring filled it at last and the water stood cold and high in the great iron cylinder that Emery Dane had built to be the truest thing he ever made, she let it run free for the whole town, forever, and she carved his name into a plank at its foot so that it would not be forgotten again. She married, in the fullness of years, that bridge carpenter who could not bear to see good iron on bad wood, and grew old among people who spoke her name with the plain deep respect that a country reserves for those who mend things and keep their word. And on the mantle of the home she made, side by side she kept the three things that were her true inheritance, worth more than all the gold that had passed through her hands and out again into the hands it belonged to. There lay her father's riveting hammer, its hickory handle worn smoother still by her own grip now, the grain of 2 lives run together in the pale wood. There lay Emery Dane's cracked leather ledger, its columns closed and settled and every debt in it paid. And there beside them lay his letter, folded along its old creases, the wax broken once and never sealed again, the words of a dead honest man who had trusted the iron and trusted whoever came after. Knowledge made physical, a tool, a book, and a plea answered. That was her fortune, and she left it out where the morning light could reach it, and she did not lock it away, because she had learned that the things worth keeping are the things you have already given away. She was 18 years old, and she had been cast out into the world with $37 and a dead man's hammer. She spent 5 of those dollars on a rusted, ruined, waterless iron tower that a whole crowd of clever men had laughed at and written off as junk. It was the best $5 she ever spent. Not because of the gold, which was never hers and which she gave away to the last coin, but because inside that discarded thing she found the work that was waiting for her, and the truth that needed telling, and the town that needed mending, and the long good life that grows only in people who have learned to read the grain of the world and to work with it, not against it. Thank you for riding all this way with us, and for sitting in the quiet where the real stories live. If Etta's road stayed with you, share it tonight with someone you know who carries a quiet strength, the kind that never raises its voice and never needs to, and follow along so the next one finds you. And before you go, tell us this, and tell us true, what have you found value in that everyone else had written off, some person or place or worn old thing that the clever crowd had already laughed at and left behind, and what did it turn out to hold? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.